Hello, everyone. Welcome welcome to today's edition of the klogW seminar series. Today we have Professor Irene Giardina from Rome speaking, sorry. But before she's introduced, let me just go over some broader stuff on behalf of the GSNP and the series. The committee that's putting this together is Shima, who will introduce Irene, Narayan Menon, and Doug Durian. Narayan's on the phone in transit somewhere, and Doug is on transit, in transit. But anyway, this is a regular series. They're past recordings, and this particular series seminar is also being recorded, and they're available online. Some of the older ones on a YouTube channel, but you should look on the APS website for it. A small preview of what's going to happen next is that after the summer, Irwin Fry from Ludwig Maximilians University will be giving a talk as part of the Fellows series. We encourage you strongly to join the topical group on statistical nonlinear physics. If you haven't already joined it, we will become a division if we keep growing. This is a somewhat dated set of news. As you know, the news is a lot more exciting in NSF nowadays. But we'll focus on the two reminders that we wanted to give you. One is, please propose, focus, and invited sessions for nonlinear physics at the next Global Summit. The deadline is June 30th. And please nominate colleagues for APS fellowships, and the deadline for that is June 2nd. Okay, so those are the broader announcements. And very quickly, we would love to have you join. Finally, some steps on Zoom etiquette. Please, for the seminar series as we run it, please make sure you are muted. If you have questions as you're moving along, please put it in the chat box. And if one of them is important to clarify quickly, we will interrupt the speaker. One of the hosts will interrupt it. But otherwise, please questions for the end if you can. At the end, please switch on your camera and raise your hand or somehow indicate that you have a question, and we will direct you to speak directly and address the question to the speaker. You can also put it in the chat box, and we'll call on you under those circumstances. Okay, so that's all I had for you, and with that, I'll hand it over to Shima.
Hi, we are glad to have Irene Giardina today. She is speaking from Rome. Irene is a professor of theoretical physics at Sapienza University in Rome. She's also a member of the Institute for Complex Systems and the National Institute for Nuclear Physics in Rome. She has received her PhD in theoretical physics from Sapienza. She did a postdoc in Oxford, and then she went to France to do another postdoc before joining University of Rome in 2002 as a professor. She is a highly decorated physicist. She has received the Italian Ministry for Scientific Research Award in 2022. She is the recipient of the Delbruck Prize in Biological Physics from APS. She's also a member of the Young Academy of Europe, and she has received the European Research Council grant in 2010. Today, she's going to tell us about collective behavior. And with that, I'm going to hand it to Irene.
Thank you very much for the very nice introduction. And for inviting me to this seminar series, which I find very, very interesting and very exciting. So let me share my presentation. Okay. Can you see this correctly? Okay. So what I would like to talk to you about today is related to some aspects of the research that my group has been doing for the last, say, 20 years approximately. What we do in Rome is to study collective behavior in animal groups. We started by looking at flocks of starlings, and then we also investigated insect swarms, and more recently we have been starting looking at cells. Let's say that all these examples that I just made you are all examples of collective behavior in biological systems. And these collective behaviors are ubiquitous. They are found on many different scales. And in this slide, I'm just showing you a few examples, which are also the ones I mentioned before, all from experiments that we have been doing in the last years. So you see here, this is a cell colony. The second image is a swarm of malaria mosquitoes, and we're doing experiments in the lab, malaria mosquitoes. And then these ones are, again, insects, but they are not biting mosquitoes. So these are the mosquitoes that you usually find in the parks. And these are flocks of starlings. So all these biological examples, they are very interesting for physicists. And why they are interesting? First of all, because they exhibit collective behavior, and we are very much used to collective behavior in strongly interacting systems in condensed matter and in statistical physics in general. So we have a lot of approaches and methodologies which are very useful to investigate these systems. But there is also another reason, and the other reason is that all these examples that I made you are archetypes of active matter systems. With this, I mean that these systems are made by units which are self-propelled. Cells or insects or birds, they all have a motor inside them which transforms energy into motion. And this is similar to what happens in non-living active matter. And in the bottom row, you see a few examples of experiments in non-living active matter that have been done in the last, say, 15 years, and that have been studied a lot in the statistical physics community. So in the biological systems that we study, there are these two ingredients, interactions and self-propulsion, which make the behavior particularly interesting because it is intrinsically non-equilibrium due to the fact that there is self-propulsion, and because it is collective. Okay? So what I would like to discuss today and to focus upon is the role of non-equilibrium. So I told you that these systems are non-equilibrium due to activity, but what I would like to discuss better is how strongly they are out of equilibrium, and whether this degree of non-equilibrium is the same for all the groups that we study. So I will focus mainly today on two groups, flocks of birds and swarms of insects. So these groups are different in that, as you can clearly see by the movies, in one case, the case of flocks, the system has a global order, which is the directional order due to the collective movement of the group itself. In the second case, which is the case of insect swarms, the group has no directional order. And a swarm of insects does not move in one direction. It remains on the same spot in space, even though the behavior is definitely not a behavior of independent units. Indeed, in these cases, what we can show by looking at appropriate quantities measured on the data is that in both cases, the systems are strongly interacting. And the main quantity that display and clearly indicates this fact is the behavior of the correlation functions. Correlation functions are extended and scale-free in both these two groups, even though in one case there is global order and in the other there is not. Okay, so in the rest of my talk, I would like to show you from data that non-equilibrium features are different in these two cases. They are very strong in swarms while they are not in flocks. And then I would like to discuss some simple theoretical models that try to rationalize these experimental findings. Before going on with an analysis of the experimental data, let me introduce the main models of collective behavior that have been studied mostly in the last years and that are appropriate to describe these two systems that I introduced in my previous slide. So the first model is the VICSEC model. This is a very well-known model for collective motion. And it is described by these two equations here. So this is an equation for the update of the velocity of each individual. And this is an equation for the update of the position of each individual. And the velocity updates is based on a very simple mechanism, which is mutual alignment. If you think at a bird, the idea is that each individual is trying to align its own flight direction with the one of neighbors. So it is really typical alignment like you would find in a ferromagnet, let's say. But there are some features which make this system different from a ferromagnet. And these features are, first of all, the fact that these individuals move in space. So the network of interaction continuously change in time. In a ferromagnet, you have directional degrees of freedoms, which are the spin, we try to align with neighbors, so the kind of interaction is the same, but the spins are fixed on a lattice. Here, on the contrary, individual moves, so their velocity, while the velocity update in time, also their mutual position changes. So two individuals that are neighbors at a given time, they are not neighbors at the following time. So this is the fact where the non-equilibrium feature arrives in this system. And this is encoded in the fact that this matrix Nij, which is the interaction matrix between individual I and j, changes in time. It's a dynamical quantity itself. The other interesting feature is the fact that the Witsch-Sec model assumes that the speed of each individual is fixed, and this is where self-propulsion comes in. Namely, there is an internal mechanism that sets the speed, the motor sets the speed, so the speed is fixed. Very well, so this model has been studied a lot, and in the last years we introduced a generalization of this model, where besides this first order derivative in time, there is a second order derivative in time, which provides a behavioral inertia to this update equation. And this term is crucial to reproduce some of the dynamical features that we have been measuring in real groups, in natural groups. So let me show you very briefly what is the phase diagram of this Witsch-Sec model, and also of the generalization with the inertial term. So in this figure, what I'm plotting is the global order parameter, this phi, which is the global polarization. It's the global degree of alignment in the group. So it is very large if the group displays collective order, and it is close to 0 if the group is disordered. And if you perform a simulation or analytical computations, what you can see is that there is a phase transition at some point as a function of a control parameter, which is the ratio of noise to the degree of interaction between individuals. So at small noise, the system is ordered, at large noise, the system is disordered, and there is no collective motion. So if we want to place flocks and swarms in this diagram, what we can see by looking at various experimental indicators is that flocks is here. It's deeply in the order regions. Indeed, the global polarization is very large. When we measure this on natural flocks, it is very large. Directional correlations are scale-free because this is a system with a broken rotational symmetry, and there are soft modes in the order phase. On the other hand, swarms are here in this region. So they are in the critical region, they are disordered, but they display scale-free correlations, large scale correlations, and this is consistent with what we observe in the data. So now, what about the role of non-equilibrium features? So, in this slide here, I'm showing you some experiments that we have been doing on collective turns. So what we did was to perform stereo tracking experiments on flocks of birds that were performing a turn. So you have seen flocks performing turns many times, probably in your life. And when you look at them, it seems that these flocks are are performing this turn all at the same time in a synchronous way, but it is not like that. However, the first thing that I want to show you in this slide is that during the turn, during these collective turns, the birds maintain very fixed mutual positions. Here you can see a zoom of their three-dimensional trajectories. These are the three-dimensional trajectories. And these are the trajectories of three individuals. So you see, while they turn, maybe they exchange their mutual position. This is called equal radius paths. It's a typical way of turning of birds, but the neighbors remain the neighbors. So there is not a change in the interaction network. And this can also be shown more quantitatively by looking at the relaxation time of the correlation function of the velocities on the one hand, and of the network itself on the other hand. So if we look at these two correlation functions in time, and if we look at on the scales of which they decay, we see that there is a very neat separations of scales. So here in blue, you can see what is the extracted from the data, inferred from the data, the relaxation time of the directional correlation. And in red, you can see the relaxation time of the network. So while correlations decay, the network is basically fixed. This is what this separation of timescales is telling us. So when we look at the data coming from these collective turns, what we can see, what we can measure is when precisely each individual starts turning, okay? And what we realize by looking at this data is that the turn is not synchronous. There is a first guy who starts turning, then a second guy, and the third, and the fourth, and so on. So there is a propagation of this turning phenomenon, and we can measure from the data the dispersion law of this propagation, and this is represented in this figure here. So xi is the position of the individual that is turning at time tau I, and the time is on the x-axis. So different colors corresponds to different flocks and different turns. So what you can see is that in all cases, there is a very clear linear regime. So propagation is linear in this direction. Propagation of this directional information is linear with a specific speed, this CS, that we can measure from the data. So when we found this result, we wanted to explain what this propagation speed was, to find a theoretical understanding of the speed of propagation. So we looked at the model, at the generalization of the Dirichlet model that I've shown you before, which is called the inertial spin model. And in 2D, the equation for that model reads like this, okay? Where phi I is the angle of each individual velocity, and this lambda ij is the discrete Laplacian. So if you just interpret this function in continuous space and time rather than with discrete indices and I and j, what we immediately get from this is a linear propagation law, and we get also prediction for the speed of propagation, which is this one, and which is very nicely obeyed by the data. In doing this, however, what we did was to assume that the network of interaction is fixed. So if we assume an equilibrium-like situation, the prediction of the model matches very nicely with what we observe in the data. Okay, and it is highly non-trivial because here we are looking at the dependence on the propagation speed on the polarization. And it is a highly non-trivial relationship that we can predict with this theory, and the prediction is obeyed if we assume that the system is in quasi-equilibrium. So it seems that this is everything is consistent, flocks are not very out of equilibrium. Now, in swarms, the situation is completely different. Why is it different? First of all, the first empirical experimental indication of this can be obtained by performing the same kind of analysis that I've shown you 2 slides ago, namely comparing the decorrelation time of directional correlations with the correlation time of the network. And in this case, here you see one example here. Here we are looking, yellow and green correspond to the correlation functions of the flight directions and of the network on the scale of 3 individuals. And you see they are one on top of the other. We can do the same instead of looking at 3 individuals, at 40 individuals, and again, the correlation functions are on the same scales, basically. And on the right, we can see that on whatever spatial scale, the correlation times are of the same order. So there is no separation of timescales in this case. This means that while the directional information is propagated through the group, on the same timescales, the network is changing. So everything occurs on the same timescales, and we cannot disentangle these two effects like we did in the case of flux. So everything is mixed in this case. And this is also confirmed by more sophisticated analysis of the time correlation functions in this case. So I will go very briefly on this. If anyone wants to ask more questions, I will be happy to do that later on. But in this, for swarms, we can show that the dynamical correlation functions obey dynamic scaling. So this is very nice. Also because the dynamical critical exponent that allows for this dynamic scaling is a non-trivial one. It is an exponent that is not present in other classical classes of dynamical behavior. So when we found this result, we tried to build up a theory to predict this critical exponent, and actually we did that. We developed a field theory that gave precisely a very close value to the one that we found in the data. But to be able to predict the correct result, one needs to take into account activity together with all the other ingredients of the model. Therefore, activity is really a relevant and important ingredient to be able to reproduce the large-scale behavior of these systems, where therefore the conclusion is that swarms are highly non-equilibrium. So this is the summary of the first part, namely what we can conclude from the analysis of these experimental data is that flux are very ordered and they are quasi-equilibrium. They display a quasi-equilibrium response because these turns in the flux, they are elicited by something outside, by some perturbation, some predator, some disturbances that come from outside. So they exhibit a quasi-equilibrium response. Swarms, on the other hand, they are in the critical region and they are strongly out of equilibrium. So we would like to rationalize these findings, and therefore we would like to try to understand in the context of these models of collective behavior, where and precisely how strong non-equilibrium effects are across scales and in different regions of the phase diagrams. So to do this, what I would like to discuss is a simple model, which is basically a version, a continuous time version of the VHSEC model. This model, let me introduce it in more details. So we have the two equations that I mentioned already in one of my previous slides. And this is the alignment force. And the alignment force can be seen as the derivative of this pseudo-Hamiltonian, where we have these alignment terms. Okay, so this is a term of alignment. And this is a difference as compared to the VHSEC model. We don't assume the speed to be fixed, but we put a potential on the speed. So the speed is constrained by this potential, but this parameter g is not infinity, which would correspond to the original VHSEC model. It is a finite constant. So the speed cannot vary too much, which is realistic because both insects and birds they cannot fly at an arbitrary speed, but some small fluctuations are allowed. Okay, then this xi here is a noise term, and so this is where the noise parameter occurs, and I'm calling, just for analogy with statistical physics, I'm calling the variance of the noise as temperature, but clearly this is not a real temperature. This is a generalized temperature. Okay, so this is a soft Langevin-Witschek model, and we look at the behavior of this model in D equal 3. So the qualitative behavior, the phase diagram, is the same as the original Witschek model, and is the same that I have already shown you in one of my first slides. What I'm interested into, however, is the behavior of correlations and responses, and in particular, what I would like to investigate is how equilibrium relationship between response and correlations are violated. So we know that in a system at equilibrium, there is a well-known relationship, which is called the dynamical fluctuation dissipation theorem, that relates the response of the system with the correlation function. In particular, let's say that we perturb our system with an external field H, so there will be an additional perturbation in this pseudo-Hamiltonian that I mentioned before. And then we look at a given observable O, and we compute how this observable changes when I perturb my system with this field. Likewise, I can compute the correlation function of this observable, which is the one coupled to the field that I'm applying. And once I have defined this response and this correlation, if the system is in equilibrium, they should obey this relationship here in black. However, we know that the Witschek model is a model of active collective behavior, so equilibrium is expected to be violated. So we expect this relationship to be violated by a term, which we would like to compute, and maybe analytically or via numerical simulations. Okay, so the reason why it's interesting to let the speed fluctuate a little bit is that it allows to perform computations that would otherwise be complicated. And in particular, what we can show is that we can compute explicitly this violation factor, which I call the D of T, deviation from equilibrium. And we can show that this violation factor is easily expressible as a correlation function itself between the global velocity of the group and the polarization. Okay, so here we are looking at the response of the global the mean velocity of the group, the correlation of the mean velocity of the group, and the deviation is itself expressed as a correlation function between velocity and polarization. This is just a test of that this relationship is correct. Once the interesting point about this relationship here is that basically once we have this relationship here, we can compute the response and the deviation without actually perturbing the system, because all the right-hand side in this equation is computed at zero field. So we have a very nice trick to compute the deviation from equilibrium and the response itself without perturbing the system. Usually simulations with the perturbations are much heavier to perform, so this is practically a very nice feature. So once we have these tricks and this relationship, we can compute this deviation from the equilibrium relationship. And here you can see the behavior of this D of T, this function D of T, the deviation function, computed for different values of the temperature, okay? So the color code here is that the closer you are to green, the closer the temperature is to the critical value. So what this picture is showing us is that the deviation curve is larger and larger as we get closer to the critical temperature, to the ordering critical temperature. And what we can also see from this picture is that the deviation is interesting both at short times, because there is this very large peak here at short times, but it is also non-trivial at large times, because we can see that the decay of this deviation function at large times becomes longer and longer as we get close to the transition. Okay. So this curve here is just this function here that tells us how strongly the fluctuation dissipation relation is violated. Another way to see the same thing, which is very popular in people studying glasses and disordered systems, is to look at the integrated version of this equation here. So since I come from the ordered disordered system, we also looked at the integrated version. So if I integrate here, on the left-hand side, what I get is the dynamical susceptibility, the integrated response. And on the right-hand side, we will not have a derivative, but just a difference of correlations. Now we can just turn around this integrated relationship and define what is called the effective temperature, namely the ratio between this correlation difference and the integrated response. This is called effective temperature. Why? Because if the system is in equilibrium, this effective temperature is just the temperature, okay? However, when it is out of equilibrium, this effective temperature can be different from the temperature, the variance of the noise, let's say. And this graph displays the integrated response versus the correlation, normalized by the value in 0. And the way you have to read this figure is that if equilibrium holds, since here we are multiplying by t, if equilibrium holds, this curve should be this black line with the slope -1, okay? So any curve that deviates with respect to this from this black line is a signature of non-equilibrium behavior. And just to interpret this x-axis, this is the correlation function. So on the right, we have the short times. So at t equals 0, this is 1 due to this normalization. And at infinite times, we go towards the 0 point here. So this picture also tells us that these non-equilibrium features that were already visible in this left figure are clearly present also asymptotically at infinite times, because these curves are very different from the black one also at infinite times, okay? So the bottom line of these two figures is that the system is out of equilibrium, and it is out of equilibrium both at short times and at large times. And this degree of being out of equilibrium is stronger the closer we are to the critical temperature, because also here the green curves are the ones which depart more from the equilibrium black curve. Okay, so now we would like to try to understand why being close to the transition, these non-equilibrium effects are stronger, and what is that produces the peculiar shape of these functions here. So the first thing that we do to quantify a little bit better the behavior that I've shown you here is to find two scalar indicators. These are curves, so they display the behavior in time of this violation, but we would like to have some more concise indicators of this non-equilibrium behavior. So what we do is the following. We pick up a short time indicator, which is the height of this maximum, okay? And we pick up a large time indicator, which is the effective temperature, the ratio between the effective temperature and the real temperature at large times here, okay? At infinity, let's say. And what you can see is that both of these indicators, as it was qualitatively evident also from my previous slide, they peak at the transition temperature, that for the parameters of this simulation is 10. But this is, we can change the parameter and we always find the same behavior. So we have a peak of this non-equilibrium behavior both for short times and for large times at TC. Okay. So the next two questions that I want to address is why is the violation maximal at the transition, and how is the violation distributed across timescales? So one thing to try to understand better what happens, especially at small timescales, is to look at another indicator of non-equilibrium violation, which is the entropy production rate. The entropy production rate is the degree of violation of detailed balance, and it is defined in this way. So one just picks a trajectory, x of t, and the reverse trajectory. And what one can compute is the logarithm of the ratio between the probability of getting the direct and the inverse trajectories. Asymptotically, this gives rise to the entropy production rate. So if we measure this entropy production rate in our system, again, what we find is that this entropy production rate peaks at the critical temperature. So detailed balance is violated the most at the critical temperature. And why this is interesting? This is interesting for two reasons. The first reason is that we can show explicitly that the entropy production rate is related to the rate of change of the interaction network on the interaction scale. So it is something that is very local. So and entropy is produced locally on the scale of the interaction range. Okay, so this is the first interesting fact. The second interesting fact is that the entropy production rate is actually related by some relationships which are called Darada-Sasa with the fluctuation dissipation violation that I have introduced in and studied in my previous slide. And in particular, it is related to the diagonal component of this violation function D that I have introduced. So this helps us to understand why we see the peak of the violation factor dt at short times, the peak of non-equilibrium behavior, why this deviation function has this peak at very short times. And the reason is that this deviation function at short times is dominated by the self-contribution, which is proportional to the entropy production rates, which occurs on the scale of the interaction. So we understand why there is this peak at short scale. The second reason why this is interesting is because it can be shown that this quantity here, the diffusion of the network, how strongly the network changes, is maximal at Tc. So this also explains why this peak of the deviation function, the height of the peak is larger at Tc. So with this comparison with with this link connection with the entropy production rate, we can understand the short time behavior of the deviation function, and we can understand why it is maximal at Tc. So what about the large scale behavior? The large scale behavior, well, my previous argument can be recasted in the following way. This is a system where we have injection of energy at the individual level because there is self-propulsion. Due to this self-propulsion, we have a change in the network of interactions, and due to this, there is a violation of the tailed balance on the local scale of the interaction radius. Okay, so we have this violation due to the individual non-equilibrium behavior, this violation of equilibrium relationships at short times. However, this is a strongly interacting system. So close to the transition, there will be large-scale correlations. Therefore, all this violation that is produced locally will be propagated to the larger scale. So if we follow this argument, we would conclude that the equilibrium violation at large scale is a critical effect. It's due to the fact that we are close to a critical point, and therefore correlations become long range. To prove this fact, what we can do is to look at the behavior of the deviation function at the critical point and at different system sizes, okay? So all these curves, curves with different colors, they are all computed at the critical point, but for different system sizes. And what we can see is that as the size increases of the group, the decay becomes longer and longer. So this is an indication of a critical slowing down. Besides, if we try a rescaling of these curves, we get a rescaling with a dynamical critical exponent, which is the one of the Wieczek model. So this shows that this large-scale behavior also of the deviation function is due to criticality, basically, to the proximity to a critical point. So this is nice because this picture rationalizes what we found in the data. If you remember what I've shown you in one of my first slides is that flocks and swarms, so they belong to different regions of the phase diagram given by these Wieczek-like models. Flocks are in the very ordered phase and swarms are in the critical phase. But this means, if we go back to this picture here, that flocks are in this region, okay? So they are in a region where equilibrium violations are small. On the contrary, swarms, which are in the critical region, they are in this region here around TC, and therefore in a region of the phase diagram where non-equilibrium effects are stronger. Remember that this is, I want to remind that this is a three-dimensional Wieczek model. So, I mean, it's you would get a transition even in absence of activity. Okay, so this is an important point. Okay, well, so once we have computed all these deviation functions, of course, we can also compute the response. And you can see here in these two plots, two figures displaying the behavior of the integrated response as a function of two parameters of the model. One parameter is the temperature, and this is what I've been talking about so far. And this figure here on the left is telling us that the closer I am to the critical temperature, which is this red curve here, the larger is the amount of the response, but the longer is the time scale over which the system responds. Okay? A similar effect can be obtained by keeping the temperature fixed, okay, and changing the degree of activity in the system. So we can change the degree of activity in the system simply by changing the speed with which particles move, okay? And what we can see here on the right is that as we decrease the speed, okay, decreasing the speed has a little bit the same effect as going towards the critical temperature. So the integrated response becomes larger, the asymptotic amount becomes larger, but the time scale becomes longer. And so why did I plot in this figure here? Because this might be something interesting to consider when looking at biological systems, because this is showing us that this system has two parameters, two ways to adapt its behavior. So it can change the accuracy of local coordination, which is basically what is given by T, or the degree of activity, the speed at which individuals change, according to what is more important, whether it is more important to react quickly, okay, and then one would need to lower the temperature or increase the speed, or to react more strongly. And in that case, one would need to adopt the opposite behavior. So this is a way of trying to understand how the system can adapt to external situations and deliver the most appropriate response. This last slide is something which is a little bit in theory, but the bottom line is that I've shown you what we got in the Wieczek model, which is the simpler to look at, but qualitatively the same kind of behavior is observed also in the inertial generalization that is more appropriate actually to describe the real experimental data of natural groups. So the scenario remains basically the same. And with this, I think that I am perfectly in time. Okay, so this is this is my summary. What I've shown you with this theoretical analysis is that fluctuation, dissipation, violation in flocking models occur on all time scales, but their amount peaks at the transition temperature. So entropy is produced locally and directly affects violations on the short time scales, but then large-scale correlations propagate these effects, these non-equilibrium effects, towards the largest scales of the group. Okay, and with this, I thank you, and this is our group, and the postdocs and the PhD students who worked mostly on this problem. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Amazing talk. So if the audience have questions, they may raise their hand. You can also post your question in the chat. While you're typing, I'm going to ask a question. Connecting the second part of the talk to the first part of your talk, can we recover the fact that the velocity of individuals is of the same order of the velocity of the network for swarms that are out of equilibrium from knowing the magnitude of the violation, or when it peaks at the critical temperature would be recovered?
You mean working back,
Yes.
going in the other direction? I'm not sure about that. Maybe, in a sense, maybe yes, because so the link could be this one. Let me go back. The link could be this. So if you look at the entropy production rate, the entropy production rate can be analytically written in terms of this quantity here. So this quantity here is the rate at which the interaction network changes on the interaction scale. So it's not precisely what I've shown you before. Let me go back with what I've shown you before from the data. So here I've shown you the rate of change, if you want, the time scale of change of the interaction network at many different scales. And why we did that experimentally? Because in the model, you know what is the interaction range. But for real insects, you don't know what is the interaction range. We have some arguments that tell us that it should be of the order of the body, of a few millimeters of the body length. We derived this from some analysis, but we are not really sure about the precise value of the interaction range. So to be sure that there was a superposition of scales, we looked at many different scales, not just the interaction one that we don't know for sure what it is. Okay, so but the idea is that in the entropy production rate formula, there should be something like these two time scales. So the yellow one for the network. Okay, so this is the time scale of the network, and if one can invert analytically that formula, in principle, from the entropy production rate, one can have a guess of what should be this value here. But I didn't think about that, so I'm not sure whether this can really be done.
Thank you.
Well, if no one's asking questions, I'll take this chance myself. In the two questions, one is, I think, just my failure to understand something. If you just move the slide on like a couple further into where you have the two peaks at TC.
Yes.
Yeah. So I was a little bit struck by what seemed like a different symmetry in the two. I don't know if you can help me understand that in one case it goes much lower on the right.
Okay, you're right. And this part, you are looking at this part of the curve. So your question is, why doesn't it go like this one? Okay. So this is due to a technical problem, okay? And what is the technical problem? That if you look here, okay, so this is below TC. So to compute this part of the curve, what we need to do is to compute the correlation function of the global velocity in the low temperature phase. So to do that numerically, it's tricky. And why this is tricky? Because it's true that the system orders in one direction, but in finite systems, you have a wandering of the global direction. It's like if you do a simulation, this is not due to the fact that the system is active. This is due to also in an Heisenberg model, you would find the same behavior. So if you look at an Heisenberg model, the magnetization of an Heisenberg model in the low temperature phase, okay, what you see is that it will move away because there is basically a random walk in the subspace of the Goldstone modes, of the zero modes. Okay, so these fluctuations in an infinite system, they are not important, but on finite system, they step by step they bring your system away. So if indeed what people do for ferromagnets when they want to compute connected correlations at fixed distances or a fixed wave vector, they simply at every step they rotate back in the same direction, the polarization. However, here we want to compute the correlation of the magnetization itself, okay, of the velocity itself. So we cannot do this backward rotation because we would not find anything at all. So what we need to do is to get rid of this wandering. So to get rid of this wandering of the order parameter, which is a very classic problem, actually, what we do is that we put a very small field. Okay, so this very small field should be small as compared to all the other scales of the system, but it should be just big enough to avoid this wandering. And you can make some arguments of how small should it be, okay? So this means that we have this residual effect due to this small field. And what you can see, because we tried this, we were worried about the same problem, is that as you keep decreasing the field, this curve gets smaller and smaller. So this is a spurious effect due to this technique that we need to use to be able to compute the correlation function in the order phase.
Great, thank you.
There are questions in the chat. So, CNR, would you like to ask your question? I will ask the question. So it starts with, I'm sorry, my question might not be very related, but I was curious. When FDT is violated, does the system's response depend only on the amount of input force, or does the way the force is applied, say mechanical push versus acoustic vibration, also play a role in the outcome?
Okay, so in the context of this simplified model, the input force is basically what sets this V0 here. Okay, this V0 here is, if you look back at this part here, this is let's say what sets the self-propulsion. Okay, so G is the strength of this constraining force of the motor, let's say. And V0 is the value set by the motor. So I can rephrase your question as to whether the response depends on these two parameters, G and V0. The behavior on V0, I already told you that because this is what's plotted here. Okay. So this is how the value of V0 changes the response of the system. Okay, so we already have it. For what concerns G, there is a slight dependence on G, but you can see that as soon as G is large enough so that the potential is really constraining, basically the dependence becomes very, very mild, and it goes to a well-defined asymptote for G going to infinity. Okay? So this is the best I can do to reply to your question. Of course, this is a simplified model. So in real systems, everything is more complicated. We are looking at data of response experiments in real systems, and the situation is more complicated. The situation is more complicated because there is a form of adaptation of the system itself, which we need to think how recast it in mathematical terms. Okay.
Thank you. Ryan, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Hi. Yeah. Thank you again so much for your presentation. I hope this isn't a silly or obvious question, but what do you actually mean by temperature? Is that just a measure of the group dynamic somehow, of its size and velocity? Well, what is that analogous to?
So the temperature here is the variance of the noise. Okay, so I just called it temperature. Maybe it was not the best way to call it, but it's not a thermal bath, of course, that we're talking about. So this noise, you can interpret this thinking at the biological system as to what is the accuracy with which individuals are able to take into account environmental and neighbors factors. So for example, let's say that I am a bird, I want to align with my neighbors, and so I want to compute the average flight direction of the neighbors. Any computation that I can do is not precise. It has a small noise, and that noise is put into this psi of the equation. Okay, so it is a generalized noise that measures everything that is uncertain in the behavior of the individuals.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think it's perfectly on time. Thank you very much for that and for that engagement. Thanks very much. And I guess with that, I would like to thank Irene and remind everyone to check in after the summer. Have a good summer, and we will see you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me, and thank you, everybody, for listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.